been a deadly shooting at an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut.
He begins firing into the crowd. Police will later say that he had an AR-15.
Two young men apparently dressed in long black trench coats opened fire about an hour and a half ago at a high school.
Of a national emergency, this mass shooting tonight.
America, at least two snipers opening fire.
Iran, active shooter.
We got a guy with a long rifle. We don't know where the hell
You know this was a scene of terror
and the
just a couple of hours.
incalculable loss of 5 officers were hit.
About how long does it take the brain to develop?
It takes about a full 25 years for the brain to develop in adolescence. Particularly the areas related to decision making, and those are in the prefrontal cortex of your brain. We call the mammalian section of the brain. That's where we see all the decision making, all of the complex kind of tasks, anything that involves sort of a deep cognitive process occurs there. But what we do know is that developmentally, the average person is not fully developed in their decision-making abilities until late into their 20s.
Is there any time during adolescence where the decision-making part of the brain could be compromised?
I would say the entire time of adolescence, your decision-making could become compromised. But I don't necessarily know to like what we mean by compromising. Youth are impressionable. They're highly influenced by peers. Their decision making often is more about their standing socially and less about the more logical consequences. I think with children and adolescents we have to be careful because most of them are capable of making very profound decisions for themselves, but what influence the social factors around them have on those decisions we don't quite know. How does advertising affect them? How does peer pressure affect them? How does what they see adults around them doing affect them in the decision?
Do you think violent video games or exposure to violent video media, does that influence violent behavior or does it desensitize it?
That's actually a really good question. And the reason it's a really good question is I think we have to kind of dig a little deeper and ask what it is that sort of exposure to violence in video games or in other media does. Is it increasing the tendency to commit violence, or is it just increasing aggressive behaviors? So like with video games, the current research right now has shown pretty clearly that playing violent video games can increase aggressive behaviors. But what is not clear is whether that increase in aggressive behaviors actually leads to more violence. In fact, there isn't a correlation between an increase in aggressive behaviors and actual violence. Does the increase in aggressive behavior actually lead to full-on violent acts in the youths and in the adults and in even, we could say, even the elderly that play these video games? And I don't think that link is actually clear. Yes, we know that it can make you more aggressive, but so can playing football or soccer or basketball make you more aggressive.
Do you think my generation, from being so exposed to all this violence through modern-day media, do you think that our likeliness of becoming more violent will be due to the desensitizing of all these killings?
Well, that's an interesting question. So if you read psychologists like Steven Pinker, or you look at some of the research, the crime statistics, what you find is actually counterintuitive to what we think to be correct, which is that the crime rates as a whole are going down in the United States. And if they're not going down, they've stabilized, which means they're not any worse than they were a few years ago. So in many senses, I don't know what the answer to that question would be, because it does look like the instances of violent behavior and the instances of criminal behavior are actually decreasing. And they're decreasing in a time when media consumption is actually on the rise. What I think the consequence is for these types of things and this type of exposure is not so much violence, but an increase in anxiety, an increase in depression, an increase in lack of sleep, and other sort of antisocial behaviors that potentially could lead to lower quality of life.
Do you think that organized crime groups such as ISIS thrive because the constant focus of crime in social media? Like, does the highlighting of crime promote lavish acts of violence?
Well, So the interesting thing with ISIS is I do know that they actually, one of the things that they do well is their social media and the presentation of their message. But I think ISIS, for instance, and the violence that's inherent within that regime might not have anything to do with media. Let's look at other things like maybe gangs or organized crime or blue-collar crime and the instances of those. I don't know. Like I said earlier, even though the crime rates might be declining, we tend to see an increase in depression. We tend to see an increase in anxiety disorders, increase in insomnia, increase in low self-esteem. And those all may be a consequence of violent video games, violent media, violent news, and the constant bombardment that we get from all of these really horrific images and experiences, like the worst that humanity has to offer.
What do you know of Eric Harris, the Columbine shooter?
With the Columbine shooter, I know that when you look at the psychological profiles of them, that there's not a lot of easy answers. But one of the things we did find is that they both seem to suffer from intense bouts of narcissism. This idea that they're the center of the universe, that they ultimately are the only ones that matter, and that everyone else is either an idiot or a moron or deserving to have suffering imposed upon them. And I think when you look at a lot of the, I wouldn't say they're like schizophrenic serial killers, but the shooting, the mass shootings, you'll find that most of these individuals just have such a distaste for everyone around them and such a over-exaggeration of who they are in their relationship to the universe that they have this disconnect, that ultimately the suffering that they impose on others is either deserving because those others have made them suffer, or they just don't care enough. That other people don't matter to them. The only thing that matters is their experience. It's their control of the circumstances and ultimately the message that they are presenting to the world.
Adam Lanza was the Sandy Hook shooter. He was found to have an obsession with both guns and violent video games.
Yes, and I know that the Columbine shooters were big into the video game Doom at the time. And like I said before, the average person may have an increase in aggression when playing video games, and that has no correlation to actual criminal experiences. So they may get a little more aggressive, but that may be tapered off by the pro-social behaviors they develop while gaming. But in instances where you have these very extremely narcissistic personalities, they can become desensitized to violence, and they can become desensitized to the suffering of others. And anything that adds to that desensitization can become dangerous for them. But whether these individuals would not have committed violent acts without video games, I don't think we can answer. I suspect throughout history you have those types of personalities, those very intensely narcissistic personalities, very sociopathic personalities, where it wouldn't matter whether they were exposed to video games or not. At some point, they're going to assume that the world around them is not worth their time and that they can inflict whatever suffering they want on that world, and it's not going to affect them at all.
James Holmes was the shooter in the theater that was showing The Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah, James Holmes is interesting. I haven't read overly too much about him, but from what I understand, that probably out of those three that you presented, I would say that he probably was verging on a level of mania that I would consider insanity. But that itself doesn't excuse the behavior. In fact, we know that he thought about it because in his journals, he specifically decided that at midnight he was going to attack because he knew there would be no kids in the room at midnight, and he did not want to kill kids. He thought it was very distasteful. He thought it was vile, but he was perfectly okay with killing anyone else. So it's obvious that his ethical decision-making is still working, but because of crossing that barrier, because it's become more easy for him to commit a crime because of who he was, it's still his responsibility. If you have an abnormal personality and then you start to add all this violent media and you start to think about the consequences of those aggressive behaviors, of course it's going to push those abnormal individuals over the brink. And it may provide a way of breaking that barrier between just thinking about it and actually doing it. And I think that's the big thing with video games, is there may be a barrier where all of the aggressive behaviors that we learn from video games and makes us more aggressive, and it does, we don't cross that barrier. So it's just a fantasy to us. But once you cross that barrier, and video games can help you jump that barrier. Then that's when you start to use it as a justification for your crime.
My final and overarching question is, does the criminal cause the crime, or does an outside stimulus promote it?
That's a good question. But because of my sort of position as this sort of nature by nurture, I would say both. The criminal is the reason the crime was committed. Now, the criminal itself may suffer from experiences that have made it easier for them to produce a crime, but they still are responsible for it. And even someone that I would say that is fully insane, if you go to the point where you're inflicting harm on other people, is that somebody you ultimately do want to give a ride just because they were crazy? No, you don't. I mean, they still need to be punished for their actions. But in this instance, I would say that every criminal is responsible for every criminal act they commit. And even though those criminal acts may have been easier for them because of their environment, because of their experiences, because of who their parents were, or where they find themselves, it's still ultimately their choice to commit the crime.